So welcome. This is the gathering, Sunday gathering of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Anaheim, and I'm James Ford, and I have the enormous privilege of serving as consulting minister here. For a text today, let's revisit Rumi. Don't you know yet? It is your light that lights the worlds. It was 1969. I was a young Zen monk living in a monastery in Oakland. Out of the blue, the abbess announced we were getting a VIP visitor. His name, we were told, was Samuel Lewis. I was a bit confused, as were most of us from the San Francisco Bay Area spiritual scene. We knew him as Sufi Sam. It turned out, while Lewis was known as a Sufi master, a master of the mystical schools of Islam, he had also been acknowledged for his insight by spiritual teachers in a number of traditions, one of which was Zen. Ours was a Japanese Soto Zen Buddhist missionary community, and in those days very conservative in the transmission of the disciplines. Zen, Buddhism, a little more Zen, a lot more Buddhism, and then a little more Zen on top of that. So, Reverend Samuel Lewis was a rather exotic person for us, sort of a spiritual zebra. He was an heir in the lineage of the first Sufi teacher in the West, Hazrat Inayat Khan, and taught a spiritual practice called Sufi dancing. That was his main thing. But along with several other spiritual teachers in differing traditions, a famous Korean Zen master, Dr. Kyungbo Sho, had given him full Zen Dharma transmission. Absolutely a zebra of a spiritual sort. We had no idea what to expect, well, other than it would be something of an adventure. When he arrived, we weren't disappointed. I was on the hospitality team and answered the door when he arrived. Standing on the front step was an elderly man, only a few inches above 5 feet. He had shoulder-length gray hair, a full beard, and oversized black plastic glasses. He was wearing the robes of a Korean Zen priest. I later learned put on special for the occasion. Before I could say anything, actually before I could take a full breath, he brushed past me and looked around. His first words were, "Wally Ollie, take a letter." A young, somewhat pudgy man followed along after him, trying to write in a stenographer's notebook. As the Zen and Sufi master's entourage of 4 or 5 followed, he proceeded to examine the large old building that had been converted into a Zen monastery, dictating his observations along the way. Mostly, although not 100% positive. After his inspection, the Murshid, a Sufi title meaning guide or teacher, finally went upstairs to the Roshi's private rooms and spent an hour or so with her. His students and we Zen monastics went into the kitchen, drank tea, and talked about the wondrous late 1960s spiritual scene. We had a lot to discuss. When Murshid Sam, as he was known in Sufi circles, and his students left and we were returned to our accustomed silence, I was actually aware how he had left a physical impression on the space that took days to fully dissipate. Fast forward a lot of years. I was living in San Diego, working in a bookstore. I'd long left the monastery, and at the time I thought I'd left Zen as well. My marriage had collapsed, I felt pretty lost, and while Murshid Sam had died, almost on a whim, I decided I would go back up to the Bay Area, to San Francisco, and study with one of his principal successors, the formerly pudgy young man named Wally Ollie. I spent a couple of years in that Sufi Kanka, their residential center. That's where I met Jan. As I write this, we've been married, 38 years. The truth be told, the Sufis weren't a right fit spiritually for either of us. the thing that would work for Jan and me and would be the project of the larger part of our lives was a hybridizing of Zen and Unitarian Universalism. Sort of a liberal Buddhism. Something maybe for another day. The point is, I retained a soft spot in my heart for the Sufis. The Ishmael in my name was actually presented to me in those days by one of the sheikhs, or teachers, and I've proudly kept it as a token not only of those days, but of the importance of those days. They continue to occupy a space in my heart. Now, to be clear, this was a school of Sufism that no longer saw itself as exclusively Muslim. Rather, it was a universalist Sufism, and Jan and I were able to practice without some form of conversion. So, many Orthodox Muslims, most perhaps, wouldn't consider them part of the faith at all. That said, a number of the residents and associated practitioners were practicing Muslims. And it was knowing and watching them that I came to have a sense of a vastly different Islam emerging here in the West than we hear about on the news. And that opens what I would like to reflect on with you today. While we are currently caught up in the morass of the coronavirus plague, and rightly so, there is a world of other things going on in this world. For instance, whether it is on the front pages of the papers today or not, we are up to our eyeballs engaged in the Middle East's struggles. Some of it makes sense, and sometimes, truthfully, it's hard to find any good reason why we do what we do there. And that's with or without the complexities of Israel. I suggest our interests tend to lie more with oil than anything else. Whatever. It would be foolish to miss how in our military presence we have fanned and continue to fan flames of fundamentalism as a form of resistance to the foreigners. Pretty much everyone in the West, in that region, sees us as invaders. And even when we're wanted, we're seen as some necessary evil and emphasis on evil. So, I suggest we can profitably do a little soul searching about all that. But also, out of all this, and while currently distracted by COVID-19, Islam is very much a part of our collective consciousness. And it should be. Today's reflection involves a bit of walking and chewing gum at the same time, but I believe we can do it. We need to understand Islam. And in particular, we need to understand Islam in this country. Our Islam is its own thing. I suggest what we're seeing in the popular media, and particularly what we're hearing from politicians, too much is not accurate. The details are mostly right, but the bigger picture is skewed. We're missing a whole forest for some poisoned trees. The biggest problem is reducing Islam to its fundamentalist versions. For instance, the religion of Al-Qaeda and the close to late and not lamented Islamic State is Sunni Wahhabism, a form of fundamentalism. Understanding that fundamentalist form of Islam, birthed in and fostered by the Saudi state, is important. And just as we need to see the agenda of fundamentalist movements in Christianity, like the dominionist theology, we need to be aware of this part of Islam. But these are both fringe movements, although the Wahhabis have more money behind them, at least for as long as oil is king. In fact, the vast majority of Muslims in the world are not fundamentalists. Quite likely not much larger a percentage than within world Judaism or Christianity. And specifically, the face of American Islam is in fact largely the face of a religion that is about as extreme or moderate as the Baptists are within Christianity. All in all, American Muslims are much more about their faith's many attractive features than any of those scary things we hear about associated with Wahhabism or other Islamic fundamentalisms. I'm not going to spend our time today exploring the basic principles of Islam centered on the 5 pillars. A simple Google search will give you that if you don't already know it. Rather, I want to address a more important point too often missed. What I want to hold for our focus today is how a rather rich, a startlingly beautiful, and a genuinely interesting Islam is emerging here within the great multicultural experiment that is America. It also points to something that is emerging among us, an interspirituality that is calling to many hearts. Now, the list for our sins in this country are numerous. But despite the fact the majority of us are Christians, thanks to the founders who wrote it into our Constitution, we have been able to resist any attempts to create theocratic control in any lasting way. I do have my worries, but at least so far, so good. As a result, both moderate and liberal forms of Islam have been able to flourish here without significant hindrance. So far. Now, as you look at the range of Muslims here, some are indeed fundamentalists. And I have big concerns about Saudi money trying to purchase influence here, particularly in their underwriting of many mosques. That noted, most American Muslims are religious moderates. And the rising influence of organizations like the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and the Center for Islamic Pluralism speak to that moderate voice finding its place here in America. Also, I notice how even those who take Saudi money seem as often as not happy to get the cash, but continue on a much more moderate course than their benefactors might have thought they were purchasing. And the Muslims I find really fascinating are the liberals, the progressives. There has been a current of liberal and progressive Islam for, well, pretty much as long as there has been Islam. But in authoritarian and theocratic regimes, and these days in states that feel under assault by the West, liberals and progressives of all sorts have suffered considerable persecution. However, here in America, a place with an unparalleled freedom of religious expression, that liberal impulse is beginning to be explored. Another major factor in this are our Black American Muslims. In the early 20th century, Americans of African descent were first evangelized by an only nominally Muslim organization called the Nation of Islam. And before long, the vast majority who found Islam something important quickly moved on to more normative Muslim forms. And now we have both American converts and people several generations deep who are genuinely Muslim and completely American. And the degree of their influence on the immigrant Muslim communities that have followed is hard to overstate. Thanks to these conditions, what is emerging is fascinating. Number one among their principles has been upholding the right of the individual to interpret the texts, both the Quran and the commentarial Hadith, and actually with a trend among the most progressive among them to reject that authority of the Hadith at all. And it is the Hadith that contains most of the problematic teachings in Islam. Like with Judaism and Christianity, these progressive Muslims believe the ability to discern right and wrong comes with being human. And while important in the last analysis, the individual's ability to touch the heart of God, of the wise heart, is independent of any particular religion's revelations. This interspiritual intuition is at the heart of the interfaith dialogue that is a central part of America and Western religiosity today. It assumes the truth of any given religion, but acknowledges something more. Something powerful is also afoot, and this something cannot be contained by institutional religions. Also, right up there with the right of conscience. These liberal Muslims fiercely advocate the complete equality of women and men. This is rich stuff. It's happening in Christianity and Judaism and absolutely in Islam. I suggest those who call for a Muslim reformation, well, this is it. Happening now. Happening here. Today, everything is on the table. Once institutions are open to challenge, many doors open. Actually, according to a Pew study, Gen X and millennial Muslims in ever-increasing numbers flatly reject mosque cultures. And with that, those questionable influences from those willing to build the buildings and pay the clerics. Instead, they look for new and creative ways to live and to engage with each other and to live their faiths. Again, we see something similar happening with the emerging Christian movement, which collectively we might call the Jesus movement. No longer institutionally dependent, built instead around small groups of friends, open, questioning, deeply fertile. And here's another thing worth noticing. Despite the fact that over 3/4 of Republicans and too many others agree with the statement that Islam is, quote, incompatible with the American way of life, American Muslims have in fact been wildly successful integrating into our culture. And it's backed by statistics. They tend to be better educated than most Americans, about 40% as opposed to just shy of 30% of the general population having at least an undergraduate degree. And I think this is an important number. According to Gallup from 2009, fully 70% of American Muslims consider themselves politically liberal, at least by the definitions we use in this country. Of course, knowing those other currents among American Muslims, this should hardly be a surprise. And, of course, then there are the Sufis. Totalitarians do not like Sufis. Fundamentalists hate them. And here in this country, they're flourishing in all sorts of varieties. For me, this remains the most interesting of all the forms of Islam. There's a reason I cherish what has become my middle name. And it is the Sufis. Our own popular culture, and for many of us, our very spirituality, wide and inviting as it is being enriched directly by Sufi poets. And of those, most deeply and pervasively is Jalaluddin Rumi. As you know, probably, the most popular poet in America today. Happens to be a 13th century Muslim. Now, some have lamented that many contemporary translators, notably Coleman Barks, could be said to have downplayed the overtly Muslim aspects of Rumi's mystical writings. And there is some truth to that. But it's messier than the critics might want. There is in the interspiritual dialogue a reaching across, a looking within each other's hearts, and things are being revealed. You want to find the wisdom that emerges as a multicultural nation where all religions and those with none claim a right to be at the table? You want someone who from such wild openness proclaims our deepest possibility, what is happening here, now, just because of our genuine welcomingness? I suggest you need look no farther than that Muslim Jalaluddin Rumi, who some 800 years ago sang to us of what he called the one song. Here, yes, in Coleman Barks' translation, in the translation of the interspiritual heart. Every war and every conflict between human beings has happened because of some disagreement about names. It is such an unnecessary foolishness, because just beyond the arguing there is a long table of companionship set and waiting for us to sit down. What is praised is one. So the praise is one too. Many jugs being poured into a huge basin. All religions, all this singing, one song. The differences are just illusion and vanity. Sunlight looks a little different on this wall than it does on that wall, and a lot different on this other one. But it is still one light. We have borrowed these clothes, these time and space personalities, from a light, and when we praise, we are pouring them back in. Okay, we may yet be a ways from when it is common for a Sufi murshid to be a Zen master. But in any common sense, it happens, it does happen. And there are Christians and there are Jews, and and it gets very messy and delicious and mysterious. And I am sure that that one song is being sung today. And without a doubt, it is being sung here. Here in this strange, troubled, conflicted, and wondrous country. It's what gives me hope. What I am sure of is that the table has been set and the conversations have begun. Christians and Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and pagans and humanists and many, many more are all of us at this table. Let's enjoy the feast. Amen.